Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into this really fascinating story from the world of medicine. It's all about a rule, a fundamental rule that was taught to generations of doctors. We're going to see how science helped us fine-tune it to make something as common as getting an IV way, way safer for the patients who need that safety the most, our kids.
So yeah, what if a classic time-tested medical rule wasn't actually as safe as everyone thought? This is really the core of our explainer today. For like over 50 years, there was this simple rule for giving kids IV fluids. Doctors everywhere trusted it. But what if that very rule was actually putting some of the most vulnerable children in danger? It's kind of a medical detective story, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack.
All right, Section 1, a rule from the textbooks. Our story kicks off with this really simple, almost elegant formula, one that, for decades, became the absolute gold standard in pediatric care.
So, let's rewind the clock all the way back to 1957. Two doctors, Holliday and Segar, they published this really groundbreaking paper. In it, they laid out a formula to figure out exactly how much fluid a child in the hospital needs. You gotta understand, this was a huge deal back then, a major leap forward. It standardized care for kids and went on to influence doctors for the next, 60 years? And this was their brilliant solution. It became known everywhere as the 4-2-1 rule. And you can see why. It's so practical. The math is simple, right? It just steps down based on the child's weight. So you give 4 milliliters per kilo for the first 10 kilos, then 2 milliliters for the next 10, and then just 1 milliliter for every kilo after that. It was super easy to remember, a snap to calculate, and boom. It just became the default way to give kids IV fluid.
But, and this is a huge but, here's the twist. Tucked away in that original research paper was a really critical warning. The authors themselves, Holliday and Segar, they said their formula was meant for kids in what's called a basal metabolic state. Basically, healthy kids who are just resting. They were super clear. It was not for kids who were really sick or under the stress of something like, say, surgery. And that little detail, so often overlooked, would turn out to be incredibly important decades down the line.
Okay, Section 2, uncovering a hidden risk. Now, this is where the plot thickens. Doctors, the ones on the front lines, they started noticing something, a dangerous pattern. The very rule that was designed to help kids was, in certain situations, actually causing harm. So you might be wondering, what's the big deal? What makes a kid having surgery so different from a kid just resting in bed? Well, it all comes down to one word: stress. Think about it. The pain, the fasting before surgery, the anesthesia, the inflammation from the procedure itself, all of that stuff triggers the body to release this really powerful hormone called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH for short. And ADH has one main job. It tells the kidneys, hey, hold on to water, don't let it go. Okay, so let's connect the dots here. The child's body is already in water hoarding mode because of all that ADH. Then, on top of that, we come in and give them IV fluids based on the old 4-2-1 rule. And those fluids were typically hypotonic, which is just a fancy way of saying they had less salt than our blood. They were more watery. You see the problem? This 1-2 punch can lead to a really dangerous condition called hyponatremia. Basically, the sodium in the blood gets way too diluted, and when that happens, water rushes out of the bloodstream and into the body's cells, causing them to swell up like little water balloons.
And this is exactly why hyponatremia is just so much more dangerous for children. An adult brain has a little bit of wiggle room inside the skull if it swells, but a child's brain, it's proportionally much larger. There's just not much extra space in there. So when their brain cells start to swell, that's a condition called cerebral edema. It can become a life-threatening emergency, like right away. We're talking seizures and even permanent brain damage.
So it turns out the problem wasn't just about the amount of fluid being given, but the type of fluid. The old 4-2-1 rule was used with what we call hypotonic fluids. Think of them as being more like plain water with less salt than our blood. The new, much safer approach? It uses isotonic fluids. These have a salt concentration that's really similar to our blood. A great analogy is a balanced sports drink. So you can see how giving that watery hypotonic fluid to a child whose body was already hanging on to every drop of water it could, well, it was a perfect storm for hyponatremia.
All right, part 3, a modern, safer protocol. So this brings us to the solution, right? After years of careful observation and a ton of research, the medical community finally came up with a new protocol, one based on hard evidence that directly tackles the risks we've just been talking about. The modern approach is actually a two-phase process, and it starts right there during the surgery. So instead of that old slow drip method, the very first goal is to quickly correct any fluid deficit the child has from fasting. And they do this with something called a bolus, which is basically a large, rapid infusion of that safer, isotonic fluid. It works fast, it works safely, and it gets the body's fluid balance back where it needs to be. And the science here is really specific. Today, a healthy kid who's been fasting for surgery gets a bolus of 20 to 40 milliliters of isotonic fluid for every single kilogram of their body weight. And let me tell you, that's not a small amount. It's a very deliberate, targeted infusion. The whole point is to rehydrate them effectively before we even think about moving on to phase 2. This is a huge departure from that old slow drip way of thinking. Okay, so once that initial fluid deficit is fixed, the protocol shifts into phase 2, post-operative maintenance. Now that the child is rehydrated, the goal changes. It's all about carefully maintaining that balance. You absolutely have to avoid overloading them with fluid, especially since that stress hormone, ADH, might still be floating around in their system telling the body to hold on to water.
And this new goal requires a new rule. Now, this might look kind of familiar. It's the 2-1-0.5 rule. If you're paying attention, you'll notice that's exactly half of the original 4-2-1 formula. This new, reduced rate, along with those safer isotonic fluids, is typically used for about 12 hours after surgery, or until the kid can start drinking on their own. It's just a much, much more cautious approach that really respects how fragile the body is after an operation.
Section 4. Care for the smallest patients. But, the story doesn't just stop there. Because in medicine, there are always nuances, always special cases. And for the tiniest patients, we're talking newborns and young infants, there's another really critical risk factor that has to be managed.
See, these tiny babies, especially newborns and infants under about 6 months old, have almost no reserves of glycogen. That's the body's stored form of sugar. So for them, fasting for just a few hours can cause their blood sugar to plummet to dangerous levels. That condition is called hypoglycemia, and the groups we worry about the most are premature infants, babies who are small for their age, and any little one dealing with a serious infection like sepsis.
So for these at-risk babies, just giving them saline solution isn't enough. Their IV fluids absolutely must contain glucose, or sugar. And again, the science gets really precise here. To keep their blood sugar stable and prevent hypoglycemia, they need a continuous glucose infusion rate of about 5 to 8 milligrams for every kilogram of body weight every single minute. It's a very specific number designed to mimic what their body would normally do, protecting their developing brains during that time they can't eat.
And this just shows you another layer of the complexity, right? Even when we decide to use the safe stuff, isotonic fluids, there are still choices and trade-offs to make. For example, you have normal saline. It's got a bit more sodium, that's the Na+ you see there, than our own blood. That can cause its own set of problems if you use a lot of it. Then you have something like lactated ringers. It's closer to our blood's makeup, but it's actually just a tiny bit hypotonic, so you have to be careful with it in patients who are at risk for brain swelling. It just goes to show there's no single perfect fluid. Every single choice is a calculated medical decision.
Okay, last section, the evolution of safety. So let's kind of wrap this all up. What we've really seen here is a perfect example of how medicine is constantly evolving. It's a journey, right? A journey from a simple one-size-fits-all rule to a much more nuanced, evidence-based approach that actually takes the body's physiology and specific risks into account.
Look, if you take just one thing away from this whole explainer, let it be this. The single biggest, most important change, the one that has saved kids from countless complications, was the shift away from those watery hypotonic fluids to the more balanced isotonic fluids for kids who are having surgery. That one simple change has made an absolutely massive world of difference.
So, what's the crucial point here? Well, it's that real progress in medicine isn't just about blindly memorizing rules from a textbook. It's about digging deeper, about understanding the why behind those rules, and most importantly, having the courage to challenge those rules when new evidence says we should.
And, this whole story, it reveals a much deeper truth about medical science. We always celebrate the big, flashy stuff, right? The new cures, the miracle drugs. But so much of real progress is actually quieter than that. It's the slow, steady, careful work of finding hidden dangers, tweaking our techniques, and just making routine procedures safer for everyone. A lot of the time, it's about learning what not to do. And in this case, with IV fluids for kids, learning to avoid that one hidden danger, well, that was a truly giant leap forward for patient safety. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.